Ryan's office revenge. I knew the exact moment Patriot Defense Systems was doomed. It wasn't when our security clearance got flagged for review, and it wasn't when they started serving that terrible coffee in the break room that tasted like burnt disappointment. It was the moment Jason Williams walked into our secure briefing room carrying a MacBook like it was a magic wand. My name's Gary Morrison. I'm 49 years old. And I've been keeping America's defense logistics running since most of these kids were learning to tie their shoes. 8 years in the Navy keeping submarine computer systems operational in the middle of hostile waters. Then 22 years building the digital backbone that keeps our military supplied and ready. But to Jason, I was just another gray-haired relic taking up space in his brave new world. Jason was our new CTO. Fresh out of Stanford with an MBA and venture capital connections. At 26, he had the kind of confidence that only comes from never having real skin in the game. He strutted into our Monday morning briefing like he was MacArthur reviewing the troops, except MacArthur actually understood logistics. I was sitting in my usual spot, back to the wall, facing the door. Old Navy habits die hard. Nursing black coffee and watching him scope out the room like he was calculating which assets to liquidate first. The briefing room had no windows, reinforced walls, and a red phone that connected directly to NORAD. This wasn't some startup garage. This was where decisions got made that affected national security. Patriot Defense had grown from a small government contractor in a converted warehouse to a $50 million operation handling critical supply chains for military installations across 3 time zones. The system that made it all possible? That was my creation, the Integrated Defense Logistics Platform, built on COBOL architecture that had never failed in 22 years of continuous operation. "Listen up, people," Jason announced, setting his laptop on the steel briefing table. "I've completed my assessment of our technical infrastructure, and frankly, it's a security liability waiting to happen. We're operating on code that belongs in a museum, not a modern defense contractor." He connected his laptop to the classified display system, which took 3 attempts because he didn't understand the security protocols. When his presentation finally appeared, it looked like something a consulting firm would charge $200,000 to produce. All buzzwords and arrows pointing in circles. "Cloud-first architecture," he said, pointing at his diagram with the confidence of someone who'd never had to explain to a general why the ammunition depot just went offline. "AI-driven supply optimization. Blockchain verification protocols. We're going to leapfrog into the next generation of defense logistics." I studied his proposal and felt my stomach drop. He was planning to gut the core processing engine that handled every classified requisition from Pendleton to Norfolk. The museum piece code had kept running during the Gulf War, 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan, and every crisis in between. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting through his presentation. The room went quiet. I hadn't spoken up in a security briefing in months. That legacy platform processes 100% of our classified procurement workflows. You eliminate that core system and you're not just modernizing, you're creating a single point of failure for military readiness. Jason turned to me with that practiced smile they teach in business school. He looked at my graying beard, my reading glasses, and the Navy anchor pin on my collar that I'd worn every day for 22 years. Then he glanced at his Apple Watch, like my time wasn't worth much. "And you are?" he asked, though he damn well knew who I was. "Gary Morrison," I said simply. "I built the platform you're proposing to eliminate." Jason's smile got wider, but not in a good way. "Right, Gary. Look, I respect what you accomplished back in the day, but we're not running a computer history museum here. Your COBOL-based system is a security vulnerability. Every cybersecurity expert I've consulted says monolithic legacy code is an attack vector waiting to be exploited. Back in the day. The words echoed in the sterile briefing room like a slap. The other engineers, guys who'd worked alongside me through decades of upgrades and crisis responses, suddenly found their classified terminals very interesting. Here's what Jason didn't know, what none of these Stanford MBAs ever bother to research before they start swinging their digital axes. I wasn't just the architect of our systems. I wasn't technically even an employee of Patriot Defense Systems. Back in 2015, when Patriot spun off from a larger defense contractor after a restructuring, they couldn't afford my consulting rate. I was charging what experienced defense contractors actually cost, serious money for serious expertise. So my lawyer, Eddie Sullivan, a former JAG officer who understood federal contracting law better than most Pentagon attorneys, structured a different arrangement. Instead of an employment contract, I signed a licensing agreement. I incorporated Morrison Technical Solutions as a defense contractor, got my own security clearance, and licensed the integrated defense logistics platform to Patriot. Just like they license software from Lockheed or Raytheon, you don't own it, you pay for the right to use it. The difference was that I came with the package. On-site technical support, security clearance maintenance, and 24/7 system administration. For 8 years, they paid my company a quarterly licensing fee, and I worked out of their facility maintaining their most critical systems. Jason didn't know any of this. He saw a guy in his late 40s with coffee stains on his shirt and figured I was some diversity hire they kept around for optics. He thought he was firing dead weight. He had no idea he was about to evict his software vendor while still depending on their product. Understood, Jason, I said, settling back in my chair. Agility, security, next generation. Got it. Exactly, he said, turning back to his meaningless flowcharts. We'll begin deprecating legacy modules immediately. HR will be conducting workforce realignment to match our strategic vision. Workforce realignment. Military guys know that's just corporate speak for fragging your own troops. I didn't argue. I didn't point out that his security vulnerability had never been breached in over 2 decades. I just sat there watching him explain how he was going to replace battle-tested systems with cloud services managed by 22-year-olds in Silicon Valley. 22 years in this business teaches you not to panic when the new lieutenant makes a tactical error. You just note the time and calculate the probable casualties. I checked my secure phone calendar. My licensing contract renewed automatically every quarter unless formally contested. The next payment was due in 72 hours. Section 4.2 of my agreement was very specific about what constituted breach of contract. And Section 6.1? That was my insurance policy against exactly this kind of corporate stupidity. Jason wrapped up his briefing with some nonsense about executing with precision and marched out, probably to update his LinkedIn about disrupting legacy defense systems. I stayed in my seat, finishing my coffee while the others filed out in uncomfortable silence. Scott Anderson, one of our younger system administrators, hung back. Good kid, former Army signals, understood the difference between theory and practice. Gary, he said quietly, he's really going to do it, isn't he? He's going to gut everything. I stood up slowly, my knees creaking from too many years hunched over terminals in submarine engine rooms. Scott, you got your resume updated? Why? Because when this goes sideways, they're going to need someone to blame. Make sure it's not you. I walked back to my workstation. Not a cubicle, but a secure terminal in the classified processing area. I logged into my administrative console, the one that connected to servers in a hardened facility outside Colorado Springs, the one Jason didn't know existed. He wanted a revolution in defense logistics. He was about to get an education in why some things shouldn't be fixed if they're not broken. The isolation campaign started immediately, but it was surgical. the kind of precision you only see in military operations. First, my clearance for the weekly threat assessment briefings got temporarily suspended pending review. Then my access to the strategic planning sessions vanished from my calendar. By Wednesday, I was watching through reinforced glass as Jason held court in the secure conference room where I used to advise on mission-critical decisions. 22 years of being the guy they called at 3 a.m. when systems went down, and suddenly I was persona non grata. It's fascinating how quickly institutional memory becomes institutional liability when new management decides you're obsolete. I was sitting at my terminal, running diagnostic checks on systems that had been humming along perfectly for years when Brian Thompson appeared at my workstation. Jason's newest hire, brought in as Digital Transformation Evangelist, a title that would have been laughed out of any serious defense contractor just 5 years ago. Brian looked like he'd stepped off a college campus that morning. Clean-shaven, wearing khakis that had never seen a server room, carrying some kind of green superfood drink that probably cost more than most enlisted men's daily food allowance. "Hey, Gary," he said with the kind of enthusiasm that made me miss submarine duty. "Jason mentioned you're our institutional knowledge repository. I'd love to interface with your tribal wisdom before we sunset the legacy infrastructure." Institutional knowledge repository. Tribal wisdom. Sunset. I turned my chair around slowly, the way you do when someone's about to step on a landmine and you're deciding whether to warn them. "Brian, tell me something. Do you know what happens when a Navy destroyer loses its navigation system in hostile waters?" He blinked. "Well, that's why we have GPS now, right? And backup systems? It's all cloud redundant these days." "Right," I said, turning back to my screens. "Cloud redundant. Because when you're 200 miles from the nearest land and someone starts jamming your satellite signals, you can just call tech support." Brian wandered off, looking confused. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. He was walking into an operational environment with tourist-level understanding, guided by someone who thought military logistics was just supply chain management with uniforms. By Thursday, my security clearance got administratively reviewed, which meant I couldn't access any classified systems, effectively making me useless for the job I'd been doing for over 2 decades. I got the notification via automated email. Clearance. Status updated by Administrative Directive JW. I didn't fight it. I didn't storm into Jason's office demanding explanations. I simply opened my personal laptop, my own ThinkPad that I'd been using for contract work, and logged into the Morrison Technical Solutions administrative portal. The beauty of being a defense contractor rather than an employee is that you maintain your own security infrastructure. My systems didn't depend on Patriot's network. They interfaced with it, like a submarine docking at a port, connected for resupply, but completely autonomous. I checked the contract management dashboard. Quarterly licensing fee for the Integrated Defense Logistics Platform, due in 48 hours. Payment history showed 8 years of automatic transfers from Patriot's accounting department processed by Howard Peterson, their CFO, who actually understood federal contracting requirements. But Howard had been right-sized in Jason's efficiency purge last month. The new accounting team consisted of recent business school graduates who probably thought COBOL was a type of snake. I refreshed the payment status. Nothing pending. That's when I knew Jason had made his fatal error. In his rush to modernize everything, he'd forgotten that some relationships in defense contracting aren't employee-employer dynamics. They're vendor-client agreements with very specific legal protections. I pulled up my contract on the screen. Not the simplified version in Patriot's files, but the complete federal contractor agreement with all addendums. 23 pages of legal documentation that Eddie Sullivan had crafted with the precision of a submarine torpedo guidance system. Section 3.1. Payment obligations. Failure to remit licensing fees within 24 hours of due date constitutes material breach of contract. Section 3.2. Cure period. No cure period exists for willful non-payment or unauthorized system modification attempts. Section 6.1. License termination. Upon breach, licensor may immediately suspend all software authorization without notice. Jason had already triggered Section 3.2 by attempting to integrate his new microservices architecture with my core systems without proper authorization protocols. Now he was about to violate Section 3.1. I could have walked into his office. I could have explained that when you're a defense contractor, you don't just fire your software vendor, you negotiate license transfers or replacement contracts. I could have told him that the $850,000 annual licensing fee wasn't Gary Morrison's salary, it was Morrison Technical Solutions' software license payment. But then I remembered back in the day, I remembered him calling my life's work a security vulnerability. I remembered the way he looked at me like I was surplus equipment ready for the scrapyard. So I decided to let him learn about federal contracting the hard way. Friday afternoon at 4:00 p.m., Linda Davis from HR sent me a calendar invite for 4:30. Subject: administrative. Discussion. Location: secure conference room. The Friday execution. Classic corporate warfare. Fire people when they can't cause a scene, give everyone else the weekend to forget the casualties existed. I started packing my personal items. Not much to take. Some photos from my Navy days, my Leatherman multi-tool, and a small American flag I'd carried through 3 deployments. I performed a complete security wipe on my company-issued terminal using DoD data destruction protocols. Not because I had anything to hide, but because operational security isn't something you turn off when you leave the building. I checked the Morrison Technical Solutions account one final time. Still no payment from Patriot Defense. I grabbed the manila folder I'd brought from home. Inside was my licensing contract, highlighted like a targeting system. Along with it, I'd included documentation showing the federal registration of my software copyrights and the security clearance requirements for system access. Conference Room B was designed for classified briefings. No windows, signal-proof walls, and furniture that had seen more terminations than a submarine torpedo room. Jason was already there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looking like he was posing for a disruptive CEO magazine cover. Linda sat at the metal table with a folder full of papers and the expression of someone who'd rather be defusing unexploded ordnance. "Have a seat, Gary," she said, with the careful tone you use when delivering bad news to someone's family. I sat down and placed my folder on the table. Jason's eyes focused on it like it might explode, which wasn't entirely wrong. "Gary," Jason began, not letting Linda handle her own briefing, "we've conducted a comprehensive evaluation of personnel requirements as we transition to next-generation defense logistics. Your skill set doesn't align with our strategic trajectory." Strategic trajectory. Like a missile heading for the wrong target. "We're terminating your employment contract effective immediately," he continued. "Standard severance, 2 weeks compensation. Security will need your badge and terminal access." Linda pushed papers across the table. "You'll also need to sign this non-disclosure agreement to receive your severance package." I looked at the papers without touching them. Then I looked directly at Jason. "Just to be absolutely clear," I said, my voice carrying the tone I used to use when briefing submarine crews on critical systems, "you're terminating all professional relationships between Patriot Defense Systems and Gary Morrison." "That's what terminated means," Jason said, his practiced patience starting to crack. "You're no longer employed here." "Roger that," I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my security badge, placing it on the table with the precise movement you learn handling sensitive equipment. Then I took my company-issued access cards and phone and lined them up beside it. "Excellent," Jason said, pushing off the wall. "Linda will escort you to collect your personal items." "Hold on," I said, placing my hand on the manila folder. "Employment relationship is terminated. Now we need to discuss the vendor contract situation." Jason frowned like someone had just told him his favorite cloud service was down. "What vendor contract?" Time to introduce him to the reality of defense contracting. I opened the manila folder with the deliberate precision of someone arming a weapon system. Inside was the licensing agreement that Eddie Sullivan had crafted like a legal torpedo, designed to run silent, run deep, and strike exactly where it would do the most damage when the time came. "This vendor contract," I said, spinning the document around so they could read the cover page. "Software licensing agreement. Integrated Defense Logistics Platform. Morrison Technical Solutions, LLC." Jason picked up the contract like it might be contaminated. His eyes scanned the first page, but I could see his brain refusing to process what he was reading. In his world, employees created things, companies owned them, and contracts were just paperwork for the legal department to file away. "This is just old documentation from the restructuring," he said, tossing it back down. "Standard intellectual property assignment. We own everything you developed while employed here." "Actually," I said, tapping section 2.1 with my finger, "read that paragraph carefully." Linda leaned forward to look, her HR training kicking in. I watched her eyes move across the text. "All software architecture, source code, and system protocols remain the exclusive intellectual property of Morrison Technical Solutions, LLC. Patriot Defense Systems, Inc. is granted a non-exclusive, revocable license to utilize said software, contingent upon timely payment and adherence to usage guidelines." "I don't work for you, Jason," I continued. "I never did. Morrison Technical Solutions is a licensed defense contractor. Patriot Defense has been paying my company $850,000 annually for software licensing and on-site technical support. What you thought was Gary Morrison's salary was actually Morrison Technical Solutions vendor payment." Jason's face went through several color changes as the implications hit him. "This is impossible. You sit in our building. You use our equipment. You're on payroll. Check the paperwork," I said calmly. "I'm listed as a 1099 contractor for tax purposes, but the underlying relationship is vendor-client. Just like your contract with Lockheed for radar systems or Raytheon for missiles, you don't own their intellectual property. You pay for the right to use it." Linda was frantically flipping through her files. "Gary, I need to verify this with legal immediately." "Be my guest," I said. "But while you're doing that, you might want to check your accounts payable. The quarterly licensing fee was due yesterday at midnight." Jason's confident smirk finally cracked. "What quarterly fee?" $212,500. Automatic payment that's been processing for 8 years. Usually handled by Howard Peterson, but since you eliminated his position?" I shrugged. "Who's managing vendor payments now?" The silence in that windowless room was like being underwater in a damaged submarine. You could feel the pressure building, but you couldn't see the leak. "I'm not paying some bogus extortion fee," Jason said, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. "It's not extortion. It's a defense contractor license payment. But since you've now officially stated your intention to default..." I stood up slowly, closing the folder with a decisive snap. Section 6.1 becomes operative. I walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at Linda, who was staring at the contract like it was written in a foreign language. "Linda, you might want to contact the DoD compliance officer. When a licensed defense contractor terminates service, there are federal notification requirements. Wouldn't want any violations on your security clearance review." Jason shot to his feet. "You can't just threaten us with government bureaucracy. I'm not threatening anything. I'm explaining federal contracting law. Read section 6.1. Upon breach of payment obligations, Morrison Technical Solutions reserves the right to immediately suspend software authorization. You have 24 hours to cure the breach, but since you just terminated the only person with administrative access... Another shrug. That's going to complicate things. I walked out of that steel-walled room and kept walking. Past the classified terminals, where younger engineers were probably Googling what happens when defense contractor software gets revoked. Past the secure communications array that depended on my authentication protocols. Past the break room, where I'd eaten lunch for 8 years while planning the architecture that kept military supply lines operational. I drove home in my F-150, the one vehicle I trusted completely because it didn't depend on software licenses or network connectivity. At my apartment, I set up what I privately called my command center, the kitchen table where I'd managed crisis responses for 2 decades. This wasn't hacking. Hacking is illegal and undermines national security. What I was about to do was administrative license enforcement under federal contractor regulations. Completely legal, thoroughly documented, and absolutely devastating. I opened my laptop and logged into the Morrison Technical Solutions Master Control Panel, the secure server farm outside Colorado Springs that hosted the actual software licensing verification system. The system that Jason didn't know existed because he'd never bothered to understand how defense contractor relationships actually work. The monitoring dashboard showed green lights across every module. The integrated defense logistics platform was humming along, processing classified requisitions, managing inventory across 23 military installations, and maintaining real-time coordination with supply vendors from California to Virginia. Every hour, Patriot Systems sent an encrypted query to my licensing server. Authorization confirmed for continued operation? For 8 years, my server had responded, affirmative, license verified, continue mission. I navigated to the license management interface. Current status showed grace period active with a countdown timer. 18 hours, 47 minutes until automatic license suspension. I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon. Not the cheap stuff I used to drink in my Navy days, but the good Kentucky whiskey I could afford, now that I understood the value of intellectual property. I took a sip and let it burn away the taste of corporate betrayal. Jason had 18 hours to figure out that when you fire your software vendor, you'd better have a replacement ready to go. He had 18 hours to realize that legacy systems might be legacy for a reason. Because they work, they're reliable, and they're maintained by people who understand the difference between software theory and operational reality. I changed the license status from grace period to strict enforcement mode. Then I programmed a final command: execute license revocation protocol at 0800 hours Monday morning. Monday morning, when military bases across 3 time zones would be logging in to process weekend supply requests. When automated procurement systems would attempt to order 3 million worth of critical materials. When the entire West Coast defense logistics network would discover what happens when you don't read the fine print on your software licenses. I didn't execute the command immediately. I wanted to give them the weekend to enjoy their victory. Let Jason celebrate eliminating legacy overhead with his Stanford MBA network. Let them all assume that firing the old guy solved their modernization problems. The system would automatically ping for license verification at exactly 0800 Monday morning, when transaction volume peaked and half the military facilities on the West Coast came online for daily operations. I sat back, turned on some classic rock, CCR, because nothing says American values like music from when this country still built things properly, and watched the countdown timer tick away the hours until Jason learned the most expensive lesson of his career. My phone buzzed with a text from Scott. Jason sent an all-hands email about his modernization timeline. Says he's reallocating your budget for an AI consultant. Everyone's asking what happened to you. I typed back, tell everyone to document their work carefully, and maybe update their security clearances. Monday's going to be interesting. Monday morning, 07:55 hours Pacific time. I was sitting at my kitchen table with fresh coffee and a clear conscience, watching the sunrise over a country that was about to learn what happens when you dismiss the people who actually keep things running. Across the continent, military personnel were logging into systems that had never failed them. Supply clerks at Camp Pendleton were preparing to process weekend requisition backlogs. Automated procurement protocols at 23 installations were queued to order everything from MREs to missile components. The entire West Coast Defense Logistics Network was humming along, blissfully unaware that their software license had expired 55 minutes ago. At exactly 0800, my phone exploded. First came the automated alerts I'd forgotten to disable. Error messages cascading through the system like damage reports from a submarine taking on water. Then the human calls started. Jason's number appeared on my caller ID at 0803. I let it ring through to voicemail. He called back immediately. Then again. On the fourth attempt, I answered, Morrison Technical Solutions, Gary speaking, I said, putting it on speaker while I buttered my toast. Gary, this is Jason. His voice was higher than I'd ever heard it, tight with panic. Everything is down. The entire system. Every terminal is showing license. Authorization required. What did you do? Good morning, Jason, I said calmly. I didn't do anything. Your licensing agreement expired when you failed to make payment. The system is operating exactly as designed. This is sabotage. You're holding national security hostage. I'm enforcing a federal contract. There's a difference. Did you process the quarterly payment? I told you Friday. We're not paying some bogus vendor fee. Then you're currently operating unlicensed defense contractor software in violation of federal regulations. My legal counsel is preparing compliance documentation as we speak. The background noise on his end sounded like a command center under attack. Phones ringing, people shouting, the unmistakable chaos of a mission-critical failure. How do I fix this? Jason pleaded, his Stanford confidence completely evaporated. That's not my problem anymore. You terminated our relationship Friday, remember? But if you want to discuss emergency licensing arrangements, you'll need to speak with Howard Peterson. Howard's in an emergency board meeting with DoD compliance officers. Better than I'd hoped. When defense contractors lose operational capability, the Department of Defense sends people with serious security clearances to ask serious questions. Jason was about to explain to federal investigators why he'd fired his software vendor without arranging replacement systems. I hung up and poured another cup of coffee. At 0830, my phone rang again. This time it was Howard Peterson himself, CEO, and the only person at Patriot who'd actually read my contract before signing it. Gary, Howard said, his voice carrying the weight of someone watching his company implode in real time. We have DoD investigators on site. They want to know why our defense logistics platform is showing license violations during a readiness exercise. Morning, Howard. Sounds like a Monday you'll remember. Cut the games. What's it going to take to get systems back online? Simple. Honor the contract Jason violated. Transfer $850,000 to Morrison Technical Solutions for a perpetual license buyout. And I'll push an update that transfers full ownership to Patriot Defense. That's extortion. That's business. You're processing $50 million annually through my software. You missed one quarterly payment and fired your vendor without transition planning. Now you want to buy the intellectual property outright so this never happens again. $850,000 is 1.7% of your annual revenue, a bargain for systems that actually work. Howard was quiet for a long moment. I could hear muffled voices in the background, probably lawyers, compliance officers, and very unhappy federal investigators. If I wire the money, how fast can you restore operations? 30 seconds after the transfer clears. I push one update, your systems go green, and you own the source code permanently. I walk away. You never see me again. Do it. I refreshed my banking app and watched my financial future change in real time. Pending deposit, $850,000. Source, Patriot Defense Systems, Inc. I opened my laptop, logged into the licensing server, and executed 2 commands. Update the license. Status, permanent transfer and transfer administrative rights, Patriot Defense Admin. Every red light on their systems turned green simultaneously. 23 military installations came back online. $3 million in pending defense contracts, resumed processing. My phone buzzed with a text from Scott. "Holy shit, we're back up. Gary, you magnificent bastard, what did you do?" I typed back, "Read your contracts, kid, and maybe learn COBOL. Turns out legacy skills pay pretty well." 3 months later, I was sitting in the executive conference room at Apex Defense Solutions, Patriot's primary competitor. Tony Rodriguez, their CEO, was a former Marine colonel who understood the value of operational experience over theoretical innovation. "Gary," Tony said, extending his hand across the mahogany table we've been trying to recruit. "You for years. Heard you taught Patriot Defense an expensive lesson about respecting their technical personnel. I enforced a contract," I said simply. "Nothing more, nothing less. Well, we'd like to offer you something better than a contract. How about a partnership? 20% equity in Apex, plus a consulting fee that reflects what experienced defense contractors are actually worth." 6 months later, Apex launched the most advanced military logistics platform in the industry. Built from the ground up with modern architecture, but designed by someone who understood that reliability matters more than buzzwords. Patriot's market share dropped 40% in the first quarter as defense contracts migrated to systems that actually worked. Jason left Patriot shortly after his DoD security clearance got suspended for operational negligence. Last I heard, he was doing AI consulting for cryptocurrency startups. Perfect match. An industry that promises everything and delivers hype. As for me, I'm writing this from my workshop in the garage. I converted after buying a house with cash. Half the space is dedicated to woodworking, building furniture by hand, using techniques that don't require software updates. The other half houses my consulting operation, where I help other defense contractors avoid the mistakes that nearly destroyed Patriot. I've got a waiting list of clients who understand that sometimes the best technology is the technology that works. Companies smart enough to know that when you find someone who's been keeping critical systems operational for decades, you pay them what they're worth and treat them with respect. The manila folder from that Friday meeting is framed on my workshop wall, right next to my Navy discharge papers and a photo of the submarine crew I served with in the Pacific. Section 6.1. The paragraph that bought me this house and taught an entire industry about the value of reading the fine print. Sometimes late at night when I'm sanding a piece of oak furniture or reviewing security protocols for a new client, I think about all the Gary Morrisons out there, the experienced professionals who keep America's infrastructure running while younger managers take credit for the stability. We're the invisible backbone of this country. We maintain the systems that work, we respond to the crises that matter, and we understand that some things shouldn't be disrupted just because they're not flashy. When the time comes to choose between experience and enthusiasm, between proven reliability and theoretical innovation, Smart organizations choose the people who've actually done the work. The real lesson here isn't about contracts or software licensing. It's about understanding that in a world obsessed with the next big thing, the people who keep the current things working properly hold all the real power. And if you're foolish enough to disrespect that experience, you'd better be prepared to pay full price for your education.